Sean Layton, Executive Vice President of Earned Media at Zeno Group, talks to host Doug Simon on PR's Top Pros Talk.
Sean, what's the biggest change you're seeing in the media landscape?
Well, thank you so much, Doug, for having me on today. At Zeno Group, we take a quarterly look at the trends that are really driving earned media, and we share out a quarterly landscape report. So anyone can come find me on LinkedIn if they want access to that. But I think the biggest trend that we've seen really break through in 2025 is looking at emerging alternative media to get your message across. And I think the most interesting thing in this manner is looking at places like Substack, different podcasts and video casts, and alternate places from the mainstream to get your message out and really meet audiences where they are so that way we can ensure we're reaching the folks that companies need to reach with specific set of messages.
Are you seeing this as the alternate platforms as the only way to go, or is it still combined with some of those traditional outlets for
You
different
know,
aspects of communication?
Doug, it's really such a great question, actually. We definitely see it as complementary to, not in place of, all the traditional tactics. So it's really interesting. We're counseling clients kind of day in and day out how to navigate this sort of new landscape. And while, it may not replace, the Wall Street Journal feature or, the big feature on your brand to get your message across, what we're finding is that putting spokespeople in these new different places really helps augment the same messaging that you might tell the more traditional media, but in a slightly different, nuanced way. Again, to kind of meet those like key stakeholders, whether they're investors or the tech workforce or even just consumers at large, in a new place that helps get your brand new but very targeted exposure to those type people.
And that also has impact on the type of spokesperson you want to be selecting and what their skill set, abilities, and training need to be. Can you get into that a little bit about how that differs, how you're picking the spokespeople for each of these opportunities?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, we'll just talk about podcasts first, because I think that that's a really great medium for, senior leaders, also folks who relate back to a specific audience who, really want to dive deep and get into that first person storytelling, really humanize a brand, and also deliver insights that are typically tailored to a specific audience or listenership of that podcast. And it's just such a great way to tell your story in long form. Most episodes are between 25 and 40 minutes, so you can really dig deep and get into the heart of, the message that you're trying to get across and deliver anecdotes and things like that that can really, humanize your executive in a different way. I think what's really interesting when you think through the opposite of that for short form, there's certainly places like Substack that run Q&As, or more traditional type, media stories just delivered in Substack form, which is really like those 2 or 3 specific sound bites that, you're looking to amplify. And Doug, what's not lost on me too is that, we also talk about, television as a way to, kind of reach some of those more segmented audiences too. And I think, local TV specifically is a great way when you're looking to like regionalize your message or target very specific places, is a great way to do that. And I know you have some fresh data that's kind of hot off the press that speaks to some of the type of folks that TV producers want to talk to. And I thought it was great that 85% of local TV producers really want to hear from those in-house spokespeople, because I think that that can really go a long way in terms of, figuring out how to regionalize your message and speak to specific audiences.
Yeah, and that's a trend we've been seeing for years. This year, there was almost a 10% increase in the preference for in-house spokespeople. And it's also backed up by the data we're seeing when the satellite tours we do. We've seen a 12% increase in bookings when we actually use an in-house spokesperson compared to a third-party expert. And obviously for the brand, there's much less worry when you've got someone who knows the story from A to Z and are comfortable with it. You raised an interesting point because I caught something that not everyone thinks about, especially on the emerging platforms. You referred to the client like their executives as for the podcast. And not everyone's like you. We're sure a lot of great PR people who are on our show, they can come up with a perfect soundbite, but also be comfortable to have personality to go long form. Do you find you might be looking at different people within the client organizations who can handle the longer form podcast type and video podcast, of course, videos being associated more than someone for the quick soundbite or the Q&A like a Substack?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really great lens to think through just different opportunities for spokespeople at large at various different levels. I would say from a podcast perspective specifically, I mean, a lot of times they are looking towards that like chief executive officer, someone in the C-suite who has like really rich learnings to share, but it really depends on the audience that the podcasts reach. And I also find like, your R&D department or maybe folks in the tech department specifically relating to like, maybe cybersecurity or even AI, like there's ways and different mediums to reach those type audiences too. So it doesn't have to always be your like chief executive who's going to go on a podcast. And I think the other thing that's amazing now compared to even like a year or two ago is AI really opened up the ability for like the folks at Zeno to get through the lens of like who is actually listening to the podcast or who is actually reading the Substack or the other emerging media that you want to be in, and taking a double click into that audience, getting the profile, getting the average age, and all the other demographics that make it a sure thing to say, we definitely want to reach this audience specifically. Well, great. We know where they're going for their news, and this is why we need to meet them where they are.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting is, to be effective, a brand really has to have consistent messaging and consistent to content because you can't say one thing on one area and another opposite thing on another like you used to. You're going to get discovered and uncovered. But there is still a way you want to try and tailor the content so it resonates with specific audiences on these emerging platforms. Can you dive into that a little bit for us?
Definitely. So we couldn't agree with you more, Doug. Like we definitely want to make sure that everyone is singing from the same song sheet, if you will. That's probably a pretty tired reference, but I think it's the best way to kind of sum up the way we think about master messaging. And then I think the great thing is being able to look at the different spokespeople you have to offer, not only look at the mediums you want to put them on, right? Whether it's long form, short form, emerging, etc. But then thinking through, well, what anecdotes or proof points can your spokespeople share that really help those messages resonate across the platform that you want to appear in? Because I think that's really the gold, especially in those like podcasts and other emerging mediums. That's really the gold that you're hoping to strike. And the producers and folks who are booking these shows love that too, because that's just the unique insights they can provide to make the story all that more rich and resonate with the audience.
You had mentioned AI a little earlier as a great tool to help better identify who might be the audiences for different programs and platforms. But how are you navigating the use of AI in your development of storytelling?
It's a great question. I think, what's really interesting when we look at the media landscape specifically is that media houses are navigating AI in like many different ways. Some of them a little bit more skeptical. Other global newsrooms are starting to integrate AI into their processes. And I think the one thing that's interesting that I'd share to viewers of this is that my own personal opinion is AI is never going to replace the first draft. We need those human insights and learnings and things like that to really look at, okay, this is the story we want to tell. This is the messages we need to like be able to tell that story. I think where AI can actually help you down the line is the sort of research arm of, okay, well, how do we necessarily bring these key messages to life? What proof points can we look at? Also, kind of just taking a look and, quite honestly, mirroring some of how newsrooms are doing this. Take a look at how we're actually writing those messages, and maybe there's some optimizations we can make. Maybe there's a certain tone of voice that we could craft that better matches, the Gen Z audience, for example, versus like Gen X or Boomer. So I think some of those nuances, AI can be really helpful, but on the whole, I am a big proponent of AI will never replace the first draft. We really need that human insight, human lens on the way that we're writing those messages to stand out. And I think, again, that just kind of mirrors how the media landscape is approaching it specifically.
In addition to typically being the lead media person in the room, You're also a pretty good futurist with the eye on things that are changing from somewhat of a self-interest point of view, because we're seeing a lot more requests for clients to use our studio, not just for satellite tours, but also for what I say video podcasts, as I call this. Podcasts, we used to think of them as audio and radio, but increasingly they're TV shows or mini TV programs. Do you think it's going to start being ubiquitous that podcasts are also including a video component?
Absolutely. So I will share that we are hearing from most major news outlets that video at this point is outperforming the traditional .com story, sometimes as much as 4 to 5% higher engagement. I think there's obviously a bigger lead time and also more production time required to make the video asset, so it doesn't always make sense. But I do think that the visual is king, and I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon. Even when you look at popular podcast platforms now, like Spotify, you're starting to see the integration of video there. And I recently read a story about how YouTube essentially has sort of cornered the podcast market in relation to new podcasts that are coming out solely because you have the option of doing it on video, and then folks can take the audio version if they need to and listen to that. And so I think that there's some really interesting learnings as more of these, podcasts scale and get reach. YouTube is kind of the preferred platform for that now, which I think speaks to your point of video being king.
Yeah, and that's something we started out with in 2020 as a video podcast to create that, but now it's also available on Spotify and other places where you wouldn't have expected there to be video content available. As we wrap up, any final thoughts you'd like to share? And I think you're clearly, I should probably upgrade you to king of media insights based on this conversation.
Yeah, I think just a couple other things that we're watching very closely in the landscape. It's obviously determining emerging media's impact. And if I could leave you with one thing, it's that, emerging media is something that you need to integrate into your media strategies now. Don't wait to do it. You're going to be behind the eight ball if you do. So it's finding that complementary role that those emerging mediums. And I know we talked a lot about podcasts today, but it's also, gaming platforms can be emerging media. There's also just the blurring line between journalist, influencer, creator. There's a lot of folks going, kind of solo in that realm too. So it's important to think about. So that's one. And then the second thing is that generative AI, especially as it relates to search engines, I think is something we're keeping our eye on too. The specific places that are popping and what results are being served up that the consumers get first before they see those hard stories. I think that that's something that, equally is important of emerging media. That is something we're keeping a close tab on too, and more to come in the next month or two ahead for sure.
Great. Well, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. Appreciate all the thoughtful ideas you have provided, as well as our continued working relationship. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.